I still laugh every time I walk into that barn, not because there's anything special about the building itself, but because of what it cost my neighbors. What started as 10 stolen feet of pasture ended with lawyers, county inspectors, thousands of dollars in fines, and one very expensive lesson about assuming a rancher isn't paying attention. Looking back now, I can honestly say the barn wasn't built for my cattle nearly as much as it was built to protect something I'd spent half my life working for. My name's Wade Mercer, and for almost 20 years I've owned a small cattle ranch outside a little town in central Texas called Dry Creek. Nothing fancy. 42 acres, a weathered farmhouse, a few ponds, and enough cattle to keep the lights on and the mortgage paid. It wasn't inherited money or some dream retirement property. Every acre came from long days, busted knuckles, and years of saying no to things I couldn't afford. When you've worked land that long, you get attached to it in a way people from the city don't always understand. You know where every fence post sits. You know which oak tree catches the first light in the morning. You know where the ground gets soft after a storm and where the deer cross at sunset. It becomes part of you. For most of those years, life was quiet. Then the Whitakers moved in. Their place bordered my eastern pasture. The property had belonged to an old ranching family before that. The farmhouse wasn't much to look at, but it fit the landscape. Then the Whitakers bought it, bulldozed everything, and spent what looked like a small fortune building a modern glass and stone mansion right in the middle of cattle country. I remember the first time I saw the plans. My friend Earl, who worked construction around the county, shook his head and said, "Looks like somebody dropped a California magazine cover in the middle of Texas." He wasn't wrong. The house had floor-to-ceiling windows, a swimming pool bigger than my first apartment, imported landscaping, decorative stone walls, and enough outdoor lighting to guide aircraft. At first, though, I had no problem with them. People can spend their money however they want. When they first arrived, I even tried to be neighborly. Grant Whitaker seemed friendly enough. His wife Vanessa smiled a lot. They asked questions about ranch life. I pointed them toward the local feed store. I lent Grant my tractor one weekend when his landscaping crew got stuck after heavy rain. For a while, everything seemed fine. But then little things started happening. Their dogs would squeeze through gaps and chase my cattle. Not attack them, just harass them. Now, if you've never worked livestock, that might sound harmless. It isn't. One stressed cow can start a chain reaction that affects the whole herd. The first time it happened, I walked over and told Grant. He apologized immediately, said it'd never happen again. 2 weeks later it happened again. Then their grandkids started riding ATVs. Not on their property, on mine. At first they cut across a corner of pasture. Then they started treating it like a shortcut. One Saturday morning I watched 2 kids fly across my field, throwing dirt 50 feet behind them, while 3 of my cattle scattered in opposite directions. I drove over. "Hey boys," I said, "y'all need to stay off this side of the fence." One of them shrugged. "My grandma said it's okay." That answer bothered me more than I wanted to admit. So that evening I went over and spoke with Vanessa. She smiled the entire conversation, nodded, agreed with everything I said, then finished with, "They're just kids, Wade. Just kids." Funny how people always say that when it's somebody else's property getting damaged. Months passed. The problems kept piling up. Nothing huge. Nothing dramatic. Just 100 little acts of disrespect. The kind that slowly wear down your patience. The thing is, I wasn't angry yet. Frustrated, sure. Annoyed, definitely. But I still believed we could work things out like adults. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was late spring. I was checking fence lines after a storm rolled through the night before. That's a normal ranch chore. You walk the property, look for damage, make repairs before livestock find a way through. When I reached the eastern pasture, I stopped. At first I thought I was looking at the wrong place. A brand new cedar fence stretched across the field. Fresh wood, black metal posts, beautiful craftsmanship, expensive craftsmanship. The kind of fence people build when they want everyone to know how much money they spent. I stood there for a minute trying to understand what I was seeing. Then my stomach sank. Because the fence wasn't sitting on the property line. Not even close. It was sitting well inside my pasture. I paced it off once, then twice, then a third time. Every measurement told the same story. Something wasn't right. I drove back to the house, pulled my survey records from a filing cabinet, spread them across the kitchen table, and started checking coordinates. An hour later, I was back outside holding copies of every document. The fence wasn't on the boundary. It wasn't 1 foot over. It wasn't 2 feet over. The Whitakers had built the entire structure almost 10 feet onto my land. 10 feet might not sound like much to some people, but stretched across that length of property, it represented a significant chunk of acreage. More importantly, it represented something else. A line. And once someone convinces themselves they can move one line, they usually start looking for another. Standing there under the Texas sun, staring at that shiny new fence cutting through my pasture, I had a feeling this wasn't going to end with a simple conversation. What I didn't know yet was that the conversation waiting for me on the other side of that fence was about to reveal exactly who my neighbors really were. That evening I drove over to the Whitakers' place with a folder tucked under my arm and every intention of handling things peacefully. The sun was dropping behind the trees, throwing orange light across their perfectly trimmed lawn, and for a second I actually thought maybe this would be easy. Maybe the contractor had made a mistake. Maybe they hadn't realized where the line was. Maybe we'd laugh about it, move the fence, and go back to being neighbors. Looking back now, that was probably the last optimistic thought I had about the whole situation. Vanessa answered the door. When she saw the survey papers in my hand, her smile faded just enough for me to notice. Grant stepped up beside her and asked what was going on. I unfolded the map on their outdoor table and pointed directly at the property line. "Your fence is over here," I said. Then I pointed to the actual fence. "And your fence is over there. It's about 10 feet onto my land." Grant stared at the map for a few seconds. Vanessa barely looked at it. Then she crossed her arms and said something I'll never forget. "Well, you're not using that strip anyway." I remember blinking at her because I honestly wasn't sure I'd heard her correctly. "Excuse me." She shrugged. "It's just grass, Wade. We improved it. Besides, we paid professionals to build that fence. I'm sure they know more about property lines than either of us." It wasn't the words as much as the attitude, the certainty, the assumption that because they had money, reality would bend itself around them. Grant didn't say much. He just stood there looking uncomfortable while his wife did the talking. I could feel my temper trying to climb into the driver's seat, but years of ranching teaches patience. Cows don't care if you're angry. Droughts don't care if you're frustrated. Land teaches you that emotions solve very little. So I folded the survey back up and said, "You might want to rethink this." Vanessa smirked. Actually smirked. "We'll be fine." Then she turned and walked back inside. That was the moment I stopped trying to convince them. The next morning, I called the county land office. 3 days later, a survey inspector named Russell Harmon met me at the property. Russell had been doing land disputes for almost 30 years. The kind of man who looked like he'd spent more time outdoors than indoors. He checked the markers, reviewed the records, measured everything twice, then let out a low whistle. "Well," he said, tapping one of the stakes into the dirt, "they sure aren't gonna like this." "How bad is it?" I asked. 10 feet, 3 inches at the widest point. He looked over toward the Whitaker mansion. Not exactly a close call. Within a week, the county issued a formal notice. Remove the fence. Restore the property boundary. Resolve the encroachment. Pretty straightforward. Most people would have fixed the mistake right there. Not the Whitakers. They ignored it completely. Days turned into weeks. The fence stayed exactly where it was. Then came the second notice. They ignored that too. Around town, people started hearing about it. Small communities are like that. News travels faster than a pickup truck on a county road. One afternoon, I was grabbing coffee when Earl slid into the chair across from me. "Heard your neighbors are trying to annex Texas one fence board at a time." I laughed. "Something like that." Earl shook his head. "Rich folks always think rules are suggestions." What bothered me wasn't even the land anymore. It was the principle. Every time I looked at that fence, I wasn't seeing cedar boards. I was seeing disrespect. The assumption that if they acted confident enough, eventually I'd give up and let them have it. That's when I scheduled a meeting with my attorney, a woman named Denise Holloway. Denise had handled agricultural property disputes for years and knew county land law better than anyone around. I laid everything out. The surveys, the notices, the conversations. She listened quietly, then leaned back in her chair. "You absolutely have the legal advantage," she said. "But don't make the mistake of thinking this is over." "What do you mean?" She folded her hands. "People who ignore official notices rarely become more reasonable later." Then she explained something that changed my entire strategy. In certain situations, if a property owner allows encroachment to continue for long enough without actively asserting ownership, future legal complications can arise. The details were complicated, But the message wasn't. Protect your land. Use your land. Make it obvious whose land it is. Driving home that afternoon, I kept thinking about those words. Protect your land. Use your land. A few days later, I was standing near the fence feeding cattle when the idea appeared almost fully formed. At first, I laughed at myself. Then I stopped laughing. The more I thought about it, the more perfect it became. You see, I'd already been planning to add another livestock structure on the east side of the ranch. The project was sitting on a list of future improvements. Nothing urgent. But now it had a purpose. I spent the next week drawing plans, pulling permits, and talking with contractors. Every step was legal. Every measurement was reviewed. Every document was approved. If the Whitakers wanted a fight, I wasn't going to give them one. I was going to give them paperwork. Construction started 2 weeks later. The first truck arrived just after sunrise. Then another. Then another. Steel beams. Lumber. Roofing panels. Concrete forms. I wasn't trying to hide anything. The building site sat entirely on my property, right where the survey markers said it should. The first day, Grant drove over in his golf cart. He watched the crew unloading materials before finally asking, "What exactly are you building?" "A barn," I said. "Right here." "Yep." His eyes drifted toward the fence, then back to me. "Seems awfully close." I smiled. "Property lines matter, remember?" He didn't smile back. Over the next month, the structure slowly took shape. Steel frame first, then walls, then the roof. It wasn't some cheap little shed. It was a serious livestock barn designed to last decades. And because the legal property line happened to sit right next to their fence, the rear wall ended up running almost the entire length beside those expensive cedar panels. Every day the Whitakers watched it grow taller. Every day their view got smaller. The first real confrontation happened when the framing was nearly complete. I was talking with a contractor when Vanessa marched across the grass toward us. Not walked. Marched. The kind of walk people do when they're already angry before they arrive. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You can't build that there." The contractor looked at me. I looked at her. "Actually, I can." She pointed toward the structure. "It's blocking our view. It's on my land. You're doing this on purpose." I nodded. Now that part is true. For a second I thought she might explode. Her face turned red. "We'll sue. You should probably talk to your lawyer before making that decision." "Is that a threat?" "No. That's advice." She stormed off without another word. The contractor watched her leave, then looked back at me. "That woman seems pleasant." I laughed harder than I probably should have. By the end of summer the barn was finished. Strong steel roof. Heavy timber walls. Wide access doors facing away from the Whitaker property. Everything exactly according to plan. Then came the cattle. Hay deliveries. Feed storage. Daily ranch activity. Nothing unusual for me. But for the Whitakers, whose dream country retreat had been built around magazine photo perfection, it was apparently the end of civilization. Within days they were calling the county. Calling attorneys. Complaining to anyone who would listen. The problem was that nobody could find anything illegal. The barn met every code requirement. Every permit was valid. Every setback requirement was satisfied. Every inch sat squarely on my property. Meanwhile, the county still hadn't forgotten about their fence, and as autumn rolled in, the consequences they'd spent months avoiding were finally starting to catch up with them. By the time autumn settled over Dry Creek, the entire situation had taken on a life of its own. What had started as a simple property dispute was now the kind of story people brought up at the feed store, the diner, and Friday night football games. Everywhere I went, somebody had an opinion. Some folks thought the Whitakers were victims of a contractor's mistake. Others thought they'd tried to grab land because they assumed nobody would challenge them. Me? I stopped caring about opinions. I cared about facts. And the facts weren't looking good for my neighbors. The county fines started arriving first. Not massive at the beginning, but enough to get their attention. Then came additional penalties for failing to comply with the original notices. Every week they delayed. The problem became more expensive. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Grant wanted to settle the issue months earlier, but Vanessa refused. Whether that was true or not, I can't say for certain. What I do know is that eventually the matter landed in court, and once it did, things moved fast. The surveys were clear. The county records were clear. The inspection reports were clear. There was no mystery left to solve. The judge reviewed the evidence and ordered the encroaching fence removed. Just like that. Months of arrogance collapsed under a few minutes of paperwork. The part that still makes me chuckle happened afterward. You see, when they built that fence, they assumed it would stay exactly where it was forever. They never imagined a day would come when they'd have to remove it. And they definitely never imagined my barn would be standing right beside it. Because the structure had been legally built on my side of the property line, there was no room for heavy equipment to come in and yank the fence out in large sections. The workers had to dismantle it the hard way. One panel at a time, one post at a time, one expensive hour after another. For nearly a week, I watched crews carefully squeeze between their property and the fence, taking apart the very structure that had caused all this trouble. Some mornings I'd be feeding cattle while listening to drills, hammers, and frustrated voices coming from the other side. I never said much. Didn't need to. The situation spoke for itself. One afternoon, Grant walked over while the workers were removing another section. He looked exhausted, older somehow, like the whole ordeal had taken 10 years off his life. We stood there quietly for a moment before he finally spoke. This got out of hand. I looked at the half-dismantled fence and nodded. Yeah, it did. He shoved his hands into his pockets. For what it's worth, I never thought it'd go this far. There was something honest in his voice that day. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was embarrassment. Maybe both. I just said, land has a way of teaching people lessons. He gave a small laugh. Seems expensive. Usually is. Then he walked back toward his house. That was the last real conversation we ever had. A few months later, the Whitakers put the property on the market. Whether the dispute was the reason, I don't know. Maybe they were already planning to leave. Maybe they got tired of country life. Maybe waking up every morning and seeing the barn reminded them of a mistake they'd rather forget. Whatever the reason, they were gone before the following summer. Today the ranch looks much like it always did. The cattle still graze the same fields. The ponds still fill after spring rains. The oak trees still throw long shadows across the pasture at sunset. And that barn, it's still standing right where I built it. Strong, useful, completely ordinary to anyone who doesn't know the story behind it. Every now and then a visitor asks why the building sits so close to the property line. That's usually when I smile. Because the answer isn't really about a barn. It's about boundaries. Not just property boundaries, but personal ones. The truth is, most conflicts don't start with huge acts of aggression. They start with little tests, small assumptions, tiny moments where someone decides your rights aren't as important as their convenience. If you ignore those moments long enough, they tend to grow. Looking back, I don't hate the Whitakers. I don't even think they were evil people. I think they convinced themselves that 10 feet wasn't a big deal because admitting they were wrong would have been uncomfortable. Unfortunately for them, reality doesn't care about comfort. Property lines don't care about opinions, and neither do county surveyors. So that's how 10 feet of stolen pasture turned into the most expensive fence in Dry Creek. But here's the question I'd love to hear your thoughts on. If you were in my position, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have built the barn, fought through the courts, and forced the issue all the way to the end? Or would you have let the 10 feet go to keep the peace with your neighbors? Drop your answer in the comments because stories like this always split people right down the middle. And if you enjoy real-world neighbor disputes, property battles, and stories where actions have consequences, make sure you subscribe because trust me, this wasn't the last time somebody learned the hard way that country people pay a lot more attention than outsiders think.